Hi, and welcome to CPQ&A with Logik.io, where our VP of Marketing, Blake Grubbs, and our CPQ expert guests discuss trends in the market. Today, we're chatting with Amanda Carrillo, the Senior Director of Solutions Consulting and Technology with RightRev, to discuss how to ensure data quality in your quote-to-cash process and why it matters.
Awesome. Well, we're really excited today to have Amanda Carrillo from RightRev on the Logik Talks today. She's the Senior Director of Solutions Consulting at RightRev, a partner of Salesforce and a friend here of Logik. So really excited to have her on the show today. Amanda, wanted to throw it over to you to start. Why don't you just give a brief introduction of your role at RightRev, a little bit about what RightRev does and kind of your experience in the space.
Thank you so much for having me, Blake. I'm really excited and have been looking forward to this conversation for a few days now. So as you mentioned, I am the Senior Director of Solutions Consulting here at RightRev and Technology Evangelist of sorts as well. My background includes revenue accounting, systems, operations, and throughout my finance career, I've actually held a few roles within the quote-to-cash space. I've had the opportunity to work with companies that have implemented software products. And so throughout, I've also collected a library of best practices that I'm always very excited to share when people ask, what are some of the things that you can consider as you go through this journey. So I'm really excited to be here and to, kick this off today.
Awesome. Absolutely. And, like you said, based on your experience, I think your expertise is going to be really well taken here by our audience. So I think the topic that we really wanted to focus in on for this interview is really how nailing the data quality early in your quote to cash process has really important downstream effects if you get it right, and really positive downstream effects specifically towards revenue recognition and some of those downstream quote to cash processes. So to start out, my first question was around, what are some of the general quote to cash challenges you see that companies are facing? Specifically those, we're seeing more and more companies who have hybrid software and physical products type business models. And as part of that, why do you think it might be difficult for companies with these hybrid business models to recognize revenue appropriately, right? I think that's something that we hear as a challenge for companies all the time. So if we could start there, I think that's a good jumping off point.
Absolutely. You definitely kick this off by talking about the quality of the data. So I'll focus on that. And there are a few factors that come into play when you're trying to evaluate your end-to-end and how to streamline operations and how to become more effective, ultimately with the goal of growing and scaling so that you don't constantly have to pause and evaluate if you have the right software or technology to help you or enable you along the way. But I think one of the biggest challenges is that there is a lack of synergy and collaboration cross-functionally, which also doesn't allow each department to understand the importance of the quality of the data throughout the journey. We all kick off with making a sale, right? Whether you have a quote or an order, or whether you just go straight to an invoice, you're ultimately kicking off an opportunity with the contract. And that contract has a lot of key details. For example, what you're selling, how you're selling it, how you're going to fulfill it, the quantity, changes that are allowed to be made to the contract throughout the journey or the customer lifecycle. And those things trickle down all the way to when you post and record your financials and you provide it to key stakeholders. But the reality is that when we have different applications that either weren't implemented with the intent for them to communicate with one another or aren't designed to actually seamlessly pass the data, apples to apples, for example, we have to pause, export data, we have to format it, massage it, turn it into a pivot table in Excel just to kind of do some kind of data reconciliation. So some of the challenges around data are actually reconciling the data between systems. Did I pass the full amount of data from, the set of data from system A to system B? The other is everything adding up? Do I have any deltas? Do I need to actually tie out or calculate this offline and then go figure out where something went wrong? A lot of times it comes down to not just calculating the actual value of what you're going to recognize and what you're going to bill, but the passing of data between systems. And without having that synergy between departments and having siloed processes, as most of us have done in our careers in finance and technology, it makes it really hard to come up with a holistic solution. So those are two of the biggest challenges that I've seen throughout my career that really focus on the quality of the data and actually getting that data across systems so that the input and the output match without manual intervention.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of automation of that and that streamlining that process is obviously super important. Wanted to give a second here to just say, how would you say that RightRev in particular helps to solve for that problem? Just a quick second to kind of plug how your solution works for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, RightRev is actually a complete subledger that has been built on the Salesforce platform. And what's different about RightRev, because there are a lot of subledgers out there, there are a lot of system agnostic solutions, and they were all designed to basically facilitate this challenge of being able to transform data after the fact. So what RightRev is doing is we're actually ensuring that revenue recognition policies are configured at the source, rather than thinking about data quality as an afterthought of having to match what your subledger wants you to do or how the subledger needs to receive the data. We're actually ensuring that revenue rules are tied to products, for example, or product categories that are flowing directly from approved orders. And so as orders are actually transacting and being fulfilled, revenue is actually automatically being assigned to that. So what that means is that the need to transform the data between, let's say, CPQ, a CRM, and whether it's an ERP, a billing solution, or a revenue subledger goes away because it's actually directly being applied at the source. And so you remove the need to have a process to reconcile data or push it or collect it at a certain time. It's actually all happening within real time. So that is one of the key differentiators. And of course, it is ASC 606 compliant. There's a lot of flexibility to configure rules and policies, but ultimately it's about audit compliance and ensuring that every calculation is accurate so that the journal entries that are required to move on to the general ledger, for example, within the ERP are accurate as well.
Got it. That's a super helpful, I think, description for folks trying to learn more about RightRev there and learn more about the process in general. One of the things that you mentioned was kind of getting ahead of this as early in the process as possible, right? What can companies be doing in the early stages of the quote to cash process? You mentioned all the way as early as CPQ and kind of the early stages of that process. What can companies be doing early in that process to make sure that they're really setting themselves up for success with those downstream processes? Yeah. Because like you mentioned, solutions like RightRev help a lot with this, but there's a lot of things that companies can be doing to make their lives easier when they have that synergy and they're thinking about things across the full process, I imagine.
Yeah. It may sound counterintuitive, but it's really important to consider your finance policies early on, because we think about the strategy to go to market, to price and package, to give our customers flexibility. And we think of everything except, well, how does this trickle downstream? And how is it potentially going to create a roadblock for me, either to pay my commissions, let's say because of allocations, and there may be a difference there, my sales rep maybe didn't understand, or for fulfillment and actually recognizing the amount of revenue that I thought this contract was going to give me. So I think it's really important to align with your finance organization, specifically your revenue team, and understand what your business requirements are for audit purposes and compliance so that you can configure those early on, because there might be something you could be doing, for example, bundles, right? In a multi-element world, which we started talking about an example of hardware, software, which could also include subscription and services and a series of anything else that can be added into a contract. When you don't have the right SKUs to, let's say, bundle that or to assign the right pricing at that level, you tend to try to look for a solution that allows you to do that after the fact. But what if you could configure your CPQ in a way that can still bundle and assign and break down all of those different products so that there's a seamless flow into RevRec, and each of those products would have its own revenue rule, for example, hardware upon shipping, software, over time, or support over time, training based on event, milestone, percent of completion. There is a possibility to think about these things if you consider them early on, because how you price and package the products that you put into a contract are going to trickle down into the the accounting of it. So it makes sense to actually think about it ahead of time instead of at the end when you're having a retrofit, because no one needs to pause and ask finance, hey, can I actually book this contract like this? Hey, I have these discounts I want to give. Delays deal cycle, and it also delays the process for the back office and the finance teams. So there is a way to remove it with communication and consideration of the impact downstream.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things you alluded to there with bundling and making sure that you're addressing kind of the right products and the right, structure of those product SKUs. One of the things that we talk a lot about here at Logik is the impact of having kind of clean and transposable bill of materials data in particular. Mm-hmm. Right? And how that, you alluded to it as well, is often left as an afterthought that's handled in the back office for ERP and things like that. How important would you say specifically getting really easily transposable bill of materials data is in this process? And how does that allow businesses to really, more effectively manage their RevRec processes?
That's a great question. And, I think I've shared this before in conversations with you, but it brings me back to my days as a revenue accountant when I worked for a hardware software company. And bill of material data is very important because it drives inventory, it drives fulfillment. There are so many key aspects of that data that are valuable. However, when it gets down to the RevRec process, what I've seen is a lot of those lines, we call them $0 lines, right? They're kind of there as information for RevRec, but all of the value of the actual performance obligation or the product is assigned at that main product SKU, for example, the hardware. I mean, there could be power cords, there could be extra batteries, it could be, whatever it is that you're sending, but the value of that product sits on the hardware. And so what happens when you don't have the right, or even just any technology to filter through that data, is that it results in a manual process. I used to be responsible for doing at the time, fair value analysis, we used to call it, right, under 605. And so what that meant is I actually had to export a lot of data and clean all of the bill of materials information, all of that line out of it, because I didn't need it for my analysis. Those $0 lines weren't applicable or didn't participate in the revenue allocations because all of the pricing was assigned at the hardware, at the software, at the support subscription SKUs. And so without technology to enable you to leverage the value of what you need it for and also filter it out of the downstream processes, you're having to introduce a manual workaround, a transformation of data, and once again, a reconciliation of data, which also tends to create risk because anytime you manually insert a process to make data look a certain way or filter it to look a different way for a different process, you're basically risking the quality of the data and you don't have a full end-to-end view. And you're also delaying how quickly key stakeholders can access that information because I had to take the time to clean through all of that data, get my bomb SKUs out, get all the $0 lines out that weren't allocatable just to get the data set that I needed to perform my analysis. If I didn't have to spend the time doing that, it would have saved me 2 days out of a 5-day process. So it does take a really long time. And having something that allows you to filter through the data and assign it as you need it throughout the different processes obviously makes the process go a lot faster. You can remove all of these unnecessary manual workarounds, and you also increase the efficiency of the process end to end because now you can focus on mapping the information going to the right places, for example, fulfillment, inventory teams, and taking it out of the teams that don't need it. So does that help to answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of transitions into a follow-up question that I had as well. You mentioned, and hearing your firsthand experience doing this is super interesting to hear. And you mentioned that you could probably save days if you didn't have to go through these manual processes and workarounds and working to reconcile data because of, not getting ahead of these challenges. What would you say are kind of the negative, business effects and business impact that companies may be suffering from actually continuing to do these manual processes and manual workarounds today? What are those? How would you describe those negative impacts that companies might not even realize that they're, experiencing?
Well, it definitely impacts cost. And anytime you're introducing a manual process for audit compliance on a quarterly basis, auditors come over, they select a sample of what they want to review. And my process was manual, which meant they had to recreate my manual process to tie it out. So it's basically like, they're coming in and verifying all of your steps. Everything has to tie out. So if you are getting by with manual processes, you're paying your auditors extra time and money to recreate those processes, in addition to just doing the general evaluation. A lot of companies also throw bodies at the problem, right, in order to keep up, because the more you grow, the more data you have, right? And so the negative impact is that without the right technology, you can't scale those processes. You basically go and hire somebody else to keep up with the same processes to get through all of the reports. And we're still probably working 14, 15-hour days, even though we'll keep adding people. So we're budgeting for additional headcount to continue to do things the same way, rather than investing in technology that will actually provide a long-term solution. So those are the two negative impacts. And also employee burnout. I mean, especially in this day and age where a lot of us are considering, you know, life and work balance significantly more, especially in the time of this pandemic, and how a lot of the finance roles have transitioned into a remote space, whereas before it was no one would really let us work from home. If we were accountants, you needed to be in the office. That's where you belong. And so I think it's really important to consider strategic enablement, not just for key stakeholders of data. So removing all of those processes for delays, because you also delay data to people that need to make informed decisions, right? They need that data as early as they need it to ensure they're evaluating revenue streams or to make the next decision on what to invest on, et cetera. But for your employees, you also open up the opportunity for them to add value in a more strategic way, analysis of data rather than processing and, you know, doing manual reconciliations just to meet a deadline. Because every time we're chasing a deadline, we're already behind. You know, we're closing the books. Some companies are closing the books, you know, 5 to 10 days after the last day of the month, because they don't have the right technology. And even when they do have different automation applications, it's still taking 5 days. But a lot of it is because you have to pause and reconcile the data across different systems or filter it for different processes. So that is another negative impact. Absolutely, for cost of audit and compliance, for employee burnout, and also creating delays in your end-to-end cycle, which I think it's also important to consider if you're trying to go IPO readiness. Those things are going to set you back. And once you go IPO sustainability, you need to ensure that you can turn things around, that they're accurate, and that your investors and your key stakeholders can count on the accuracy of the data.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense. And in freeing up one thing that resonated with me that you said is freeing up your team to focus on the more strategic initiatives too, right? I think that's something that a lot of companies might overlook with their technology stack in general, specifically with their quote to cash technology, and that there can be a lot of manual processes involved at every stage of that. How do you make sure that you're setting your team up for the most success and making the most out of the resources that you have? So that's really good to hear you talk through that. The last question that I have for you here, Amanda, and this has been really great, and I've learned a lot on this during this conversation so far. But in general, how would you recommend that IT teams and digital teams, when they're evaluating all the elements of their quote to cash technology stack in general, you know, how do you recommend that they look at how technology addresses their processes differently to ensure that there's a more streamlined, you know, as we were just alluding to, more efficient, resource efficient end-to-end process in their quote to cash strategy?
That's a great question. And the first thing that comes to mind is something that I love to bring up every single time, especially when I'm working with prospects and even just having an early discovery conversation. For IT teams, especially those that are tasked with evaluating different vendors, different technologies, it's really important to consider the end-to-end reporting requirements. It's another thing that tends to be an afterthought. It's almost considered to be a phase 2 after we find the right technology and after we implement and get our ducks in a row. Let's think about reporting after the fact. It's almost too late, because by then you're introducing another manual way to get the data aggregated in a way that needs to be analyzed or reviewed by specific stakeholders. So definitely consider end-to-end reporting requirements. What I mean by that is there will always be the need to have a view of, let's say, bookings, billings, revenue, payments, and, you know, where we are in the process, how much revenue we've recognized, how much have we delivered against these particular products, SKUs, training services, et cetera. And because all of the different applications and even our processes traditionally have been siloed, we don't really think about the holistic positive impact that we could have if we have all of the data in a place where we can also create reports automatically that give us visibility into each of those categories, because that's really what you need to do an assessment of revenue streams, of whether a product is successful, if you want to launch a new one, if you want to remove other products from your price list, etc. So consider, once again, the finance impact based on policy, so you can get ahead of that, and the end-to-end reporting requirements for every single stakeholder of that data that basically flows from the moment that you book something, you price it, and you order it.
Yep. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And thinking about the end of the process at the very beginning seems like kind of the message here, and making sure that your data is going to be set up in the right way for success all the way through the process. So Amanda, this has been great. Like I said, I learned a lot during this conversation. I think our audience will as well. So thank you so much for joining here. I really appreciate it. And for anyone listening, go check out RightRev if you have these needs in your business, or if any of these challenges resonate with you. So thanks again, Amanda. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Blake. Really appreciate your time.
Awesome.